Welcome back to Chimes at Midnight. We are going to go now to part 2 of our 3-part series on the martini. What we want to talk about is the classic martini and how it developed in America, but also in Europe because it has important implications. First of all, the martini is quintessentially an American drink in its purity, its strength, its rawness. It seems to say something about the American character. However, in 1920, January 16th, 1920, Prohibition came into effect in the United States. And by then, a lot of bartenders had already decamped and moved to Europe, most of them to places like Paris and London. And soon after, a lot of people from America who liked their drinks strong, especially it seems writers and artists of other sorts, also followed them and moved to places like Paris, where you can ply your trade just as well as you could if you were in New York City. What happens is the martini gets introduced to Europe in ways that it hadn't been before. And the place that I think we should begin is with Harry's New York Bar in Paris. The time is 1927. Here, for the first time in Harry's book, Barflies and Cocktails, we see the classic martini called a martini. No longer is it called a Martinez, and there were several other names that appeared. So what we'd like to do is make that classic martini right now and then talk about what changed afterwards. So the classic martini, according to Harry, had 2 ounces of, by then it could have been London dry gin because it was certainly around and available. He preferred Plymouth gin, which is not quite London dry and not quite Old Tom, is still available and is the favorite of many people today. But we're going to just use Beefeater because that's where we started because we're out of Plymouth. So 2 ounces of, I think we're going to go with 3 ounces. And then we're going to have, I think it's 1.5 ounces, so it's 2-to-1 ratio of dry vermouth. We're using Dolan. Harry would have used Nolly Pratt. Dolan wasn't around yet, but this was something that the customer could ask for or not, but orange bitters. So we're just going to use a dash of orange bitters. Now notice that Alex is not using the stirring glass, he's using the shaker. And that's because Harry prescribes shaking for this drink. It's a strange thing at that period. You never know whether they're going to say you got to shake it or you got to stir it. Today, anything that doesn't need to be emulsified, which is to say anything that doesn't include citrus or egg white or milk, will be stirred. Back then, it could be shaken no matter what. And just one more thing, I gotta say this, but it's an anachronism to believe that James Bond invented the shaken martini. They've been shaking those martinis for, 50, 60 years before James Bond came along and shook his martini. So a few good shakes. It does not bruise the gin, by the way. It will be just fine. What it does, though, is it makes it a little cloudy. To me, it looks less pure. That's why I prefer my martinis to be stirred, not shaken. No garnish. There it is. Classic martini. Let's just give it a quick taste. Now, if it had stopped there, it wouldn't be nearly as good as a martini, but it wouldn't be nearly as bad as a glass of cold gin. So a few more things about Harry's New York Bar. He invented lots of drinks, I should say, including the sidecar, which is still a classic and still one of the great drinks. The Boulevardier, which I think is a wonderful riff on the Negroni. Maybe for those reasons, among others, it was a place that lots of, particularly American expatriates, spent a lot of time in Paris. And among those expatriates were people like Sinclair Lewis, Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and above all, Ernest Hemingway. I think that Hemingway began to have a particularly powerful influence on the way people took their martinis, because even as Harry's New York Bar was saying, you make a martini with 2 parts gin to 1 part vermouth, Hemingway was saying, fill that glass with gin and give me a teaspoon of vermouth. Hemingway first of all, he was diabetic, so he didn't like, sweet was dangerous for him, but also he believed that sweet things stood between him and his drunk. And so the more gin you can fit in here and the less vermouth, the more powerful and the quicker the drunk could take effect. And Hemingway was easily the most famous alcoholic of his day. He was also one of the most influential. I mean, he, in many respects, defined masculinity. So it became easier and easier for a gentleman to say, the drier I want my martini, the more I'll resemble Ernest Hemingway. And if I don't like it dry, if I like it sweet, well, maybe I'm not the man that I would like to be.